we often miss out when we are talking of assessment. And I'm sure you must have heard this term, systems approach to education. Can you just briefly tell me what this is? भूल गए. Okay. Anybody from the backbenches? Systems approach?
It's the educational objectives, the teaching, learning activities. They actually should align.
Okay, so basically what we mean when we say systems approach to education is that education is a system. And by definition, system has components which are interdependent. So you cannot change just one and hope everything will become all right. We have seen, like, for example, when PG entrance examination was introduced, we changed only one thing. We never changed the corresponding teaching learning activities. With the result, the students stopped learning the way we wanted, they started learning the way for only MCQs. So this is what basically in systems approach to education. Now, there are three components of an educational system: input, process, and output. And when we talk of input, then some examples would be
The way we teach them, the learning things we want them to learn.
okay, so the students, the teachers, the course material, the books, resources, library, classroom, practicals, patients. So these are all the inputs for educational system. And then there is a process.
Learning.
Process means learning. And this processing results in a permanent change in behavior. Now, by definition, what is learning? Learning is a permanent change in behavior as a result of practice. Interestingly, the most important part of the educational system, that is the processing, that happens inside the student's mind. So there's no way you can actually see what is happening there. But what we can see is what change in behavior has happened as a result of that processing. So that gives us an idea about what kind of learning is happening. Now, you have input and you have processes, and then you have an expected outcome. For example, I'll take the student to the ward, I'll show him the patient, and then he will learn how to take a good history. That's your expected learning outcome. But outcomes are not always what you expect them to be. And there is actually sometimes a gross difference between your expected outcome and your actual outcome. You want them to do one thing, but somehow because of the various factors, they learn it totally other way around. And that is where the role of feedback comes. And what this feedback does, it tells the students how to alter their process, and it tells the teachers and institutions how to change the input. You know, for example, if you are admitting students and you find they are not so good in English, they are not able to understand English, and that is one of the reasons why they are not able to understand, then obviously you have to work on that part also. Because without actually helping them to understand English, you can't expect that they would understand everything that you teach them about in medicine. And from where this feedback comes? This feedback comes from a difference between the expected outcome and the actual outcome. And that is what assessment tells you. The difference between what you have written and what the students have actually attained during the period of learning. So that brings us to what is assessment. So you try telling what is assessment?
Assessment is to assess the students what have been taught to them. We expect them to interpret what we have given to them in the way, and the way they perform.
Okay. So, any additions? Any additions? Assessment? आगे आ जाओ आगे आ जाओ हाँ any additions? No. Okay. So basically, this assessment actually originated from a Latin verb, which was accidere. And what this word actually means is supposed to sit with the learner. Now, see the difference between what was intended and what we actually do. The purpose of assessment is you do something with and for the students, not to the students. What we do, we give them a test, okay, लिख देना, copy submit कर देना, finish. But we don't really sit with them to find out what they are learning and why they are learning what they are learning. And what can we do to improve the learning process. So let's get the terms right, because sometimes there could be confusion between what we mean by one or the other. So let's begin with the first one, and that is formative assessment. Now, if you look at the definition, and please remember these two gentlemen, Black and William, they are very famous for giving a shape, direction, and scientific contribution to formative assessment. So what Black and Williams said, that formative assessment and each word actually means a lot. So go slow and try to see that we pick up what is said in that definition. So a range of formal and informal assessments. So that is the first thing, that you don't always have to call them, okay, come sit in the class, I'll give you a test. Not necessarily. There are a whole lot of, we'll talk about that. There are a whole lot of informal opportunities which you have to assess the student. So assessment procedures conducted by the teachers, and that is the second keyword. What was the first keyword? Formal and informal. And the second keyword, during learning process, not at the end of learning, during learning process. Third keyword, in order to modify teaching and learning. And lastly, to improve the student attainment. जो हम करंट असेसमेंट करते हैं और जो ये डेफिनेशन है, उसमें क्या स्ट्राइकिंगली डिफरेंट आपको लगता है?
उनको फीडबैक्स नहीं, फॉर्मल नहीं होती, करने की जरूरत है.
So basically, our current assessment is only to assess student learning. We don't really modify teaching, we don't modify learning activities, and we don't aim to improve the learning process. Teaching, of course, but basically learning process. So if you have to tell me three keywords, what are those?
Formal and informal assessment. During the learning phase.
The learning.
Proof the learning. Improvement.
And
Improvement.
Modify teaching and learning process. So these are four important components of formative assessment. You may also come across this term abbreviated as A4L, but which actually stands for Assessment for Learning. And what is assessment for learning? It's a process of seeking and interpreting evidence for use by learners and teachers to decide where the learners are in their learning, where they need to go, and how best to go there. So if you compare the two definitions, by and large, they are similar. So in assessment for learning, you are looking at a process. It's a, if I say it that way, it's a verb. Formative assessment is a noun. So just keep that in mind. Formative assessment is it now, कुछ करना होता है. But when we talk of assessment for learning, it's a process where there are actual steps involved for doing certain things. Next, summative assessment. Now, summative assessment is something which is used to evaluate student learning and achievement at the conclusion of a specific instructional period. Formative कब था? During instruction. Summative कब है?
At the end.
End of instruction. And what I want to emphasize here, and that actually might come as a surprise, as it came to me also when I read it for the first time, that we are talking of end of something. Summative, sum, total.
So,
End of something. And what can be that end? It may be end of the project, end of the unit, end of the course, end of the semester, even end of the lecture, end of your classroom. So what basically summative means, it is at the end of something. Whereas formative is during the learning process. Now that's very important difference, because during the process, sometimes I give that example, and maybe you have already heard about that, that if you fire a missile, you have to monitor its progress continuously. You cannot say कि अच्छा चलो अपने ही country में गिर गया, कोई नहीं अगली बार सोचेंगे. You can't afford to do that. When you have fired it, then you have to monitor where is it going. And if it is going in a wrong direction, then you have to make suitable arrangements and adjustments so that it goes and hits the target rather than actually falling somewhere here and there. So all assessments are summative by default. Summative हमने क्या कहा था? End of something. Every assessment is end of something. जब आप अपना चैप्टर पढ़ा के टेस्ट लेते हो तो इट्स एंड ऑफ द समथिंग. जब आप 3 महीने बाद लेते हो या 6 महीने बाद लेते हो, दैट इज एंड ऑफ समथिंग. स्टैंड अप लेते हो जब, दैट इज एंड ऑफ समथिंग. सो बाय डिफॉल्ट all assessments are summative, and they become formative only when the results are used to improve teaching and learning. So it is not the time. You ask any teacher and spontaneously he'll say what is formative, जो हम सारा साल लेते हैं, what is summative, जो यूनिवर्सिटी का इम्तिहान होता है. But that's not the right interpretation. जो हम सारा साल लेते हैं actually वो भी summative होते हैं. They're also not formative. They'll become formative only when you use them to improve the teaching learning process and the inputs which are required for. You may have taught them on a mannequin, but you may find that they are finding it difficult to handle a patient. So your input has to change. So what defines or differentiates formative and summative? The intended use. Why you are assessing? To know how much the student has learned or to improve the learning. And that is what differentiates between formative and summative. But please remember, by default, all assessments are summative. Now, another term which is commonly used is assessment to promote learning. And that's very interesting. When you have multiple classroom assessments, you may not decide pass fail on each individual one, but you can add them up and then maybe finally decide at the end whether the student passes or not. But other way cannot be done. You cannot use university marks to go back and decide, oh, I should have taught like this and not like that. That cannot be done. So please keep that in mind, that multiple formatives can be combined to make a summative decision. But summatives cannot be broken down to make formative decisions. And maybe 2 or 3 weeks down the line, we'll talk about programmatic assessment, when you'll realize that this factor comes up in a very big way, whether to use summative or to use formative. And so what are the key differences between summative and formative? Here are some of them. I won't read the table, but what basically you would notice is that the purpose of formative is to provide ongoing feedback to improve learning, whereas summative is to decide how much the student has learned at the end of the instructional period. Student motivation for formative is intrinsic. Keep that in mind. No student will come to you without an intrinsic motivation for formative assessment. You know, in new curriculum, for example, there are a lot of formative assessments. जिनका कुछ नहीं करना है. You don't have to add those marks anywhere. Now that is where the question of motivation comes. Summative, earlier what happened? All internal assessment marks were added to the university examination marks. So there was a motivation in the form of marks. But now that motivation is gone. So the motivation has to come from within. And how that motivation will come? That will be to tell the student that this assessment is going to improve their work. That is what is going to motivate them for formative assessments. हाँ जी.
So, but really, in terms of time finding counting motives, like you are expecting right now.
That's why I didn't use the term internal assessment. I said formative. I didn't say internal assessment.
एक बार हमारे को टेस्ट होते हैं हम उसकी बेस के ऊपर ही बना रहे हैं.
Formative assessment तो informal भी है ना.
जो फॉर्मल है फॉर्मल फॉर्मल के साथ लाइंस निकल रही फॉर्मल एंड इनफॉर्मल फॉर्मल जो है इसके बेस के ऊपर तो फ्लैट के ना होगा कि इंटरनल असेसमेंट भी कैलकुलेटेड तो उसको फिर हम वर्ड समेटिव बोलेंगे.
Yes. Yes. That is summative. Summative. Yes.
वो बिजनेस और ठीक है मेरा प्रोजेक्ट था उसमें समेटिव वर्ड यूज किया तो वहां पे वो नोटिस इंटरनल रिजेक्शन वाली चीज आप फॉर्मेटिव चेंज करो.
No, it cannot be formative unless and you can use one assessment for both purposes. It can work as formative as well as summative. But that formative function has to be there, simply because it is not a university examination, does not automatically transform it into a formative assessment. That is very clear. And so when you are taking, what period you are taking, internal examiner ले रहे हैं कि बाहर से examiners आ रहे हैं, they are not the deciding factor. What is the deciding factor? What are you doing with the assessment data that you have generated? And as I said, by default, all assessment is summative. तो वो जो so-called formative हम लेते हैं, तो unless you use that to improve learning, you are actually conducting another summative assessment.
चॉइस बेस्ड क्रेडिट सिस्टम तो है हमारा सीबीएसई उसमें तो जो फर्स्ट आर्ली एग्जाम है मिड टर्म है सेकंड आर्ली है वो भी यूनिवर्सिटी एग्जाम उसकी वेटेज पे ऐड अप हो रही है. इसका मतलब वो तो फिर समेटिव ही हो गया.
नहीं. I said you can, yes, you can use it for both purposes. And there is nothing against. Like, for example, I'll give you my most strict example. When I went for MHP, वहाँ पे कोई यूनिवर्सिटी इम्तिहान नहीं होता. वो थ्रू आउट द ईयर होते रहते हैं, उसी पे आपको फीडबैक मिलती रहती है. एंड में उन्हीं को जोड़ के वो डिसाइड कर लेते हैं कि आपने आगे जाना है कि पीछे रहना. सो वन असेसमेंट सर्व्स टू पर्पसेस. और एक्चुअली प्रोग्रामेटिक में, इफ यू रिमेंबर, we'll deal with it again, but if you remember my old presentation, then in programmatic you are actually diluting the boundary between summative and formative. It आजकल टर्म ही नहीं यूज करते. It's only assessment. What you do with that assessment is a different.
These are the guns think formative that should be accessible. The table of
आप उसको दोनों में यूज कर लो ना। हाँ, you just write assessments and it is for the teachers to decide कि आपने उस असेसमेंट का क्या करना है। इट्स अंडरस्टूड कि अगर नॉन यूनिवर्सिटी एग्जाम है तो वो सिर्फ टेस्ट लेने का तो फायदा नहीं है, अनलेस यू रियली गिव फीडबैक टू द स्टूडेंट टू इम्प्रूव हिज लर्निंग। उसका बेसिक पर्पज ही वही है। इनफैक्ट वो नेशनल एजुकेशन पॉलिसी में है, और अगर आप इनका स्कूल के बच्चों का देखो, +2 का और 10th का, वहां उसका पर्पज ही यही होता है। देर ऑल फॉर्मेटिव असेसमेंट।
choice-based credit system out when we have the discovery examination. We distribute the mark answer sheets in the class and discuss it. The students will discuss that required to be submitted.
I sometimes give that example what I used to do for my formative. आप एक छोटा सा टेस्ट दे दो उनको and ask them to pass their answer sheets to somebody else. Like ringing the bell, passing the parcel वाला, तो 2 3 4 पास होने दो, then you stop. Then as a teacher, I speak out the correct answer. The students, they pick or cross depending on whether it is right or wrong. It helps two ways. One, that it tells them what is the right answer. Second, it also tells them कि किसी और ने उस क्वेश्चन को कैसे अटेम्प्ट किया। अदरवाइज दे डोंट एवर कम टू नो। उनके हिसाब से जो मैं करता हूँ वो सबसे अच्छा है, बट मे बी somebody else is doing it in a better way. So that is one of the functions which you can do. And therefore, if you actually look at effect on learning, then formative assessment has very strong positive and lasting effect, contrasted to the summative assessment, which has got a very weak and a fleeting effect. Summative के लिए वो स्टूडेंट सिर्फ उसी दिन के लिए पढ़ता है, 3 दिन पहले वो रट्टा मारता है, इम्तिहान के 3 घंटे बाद वो साफ हो जाता है। Contrasted to formative, which has a very strong and positive effect. Now, to avoid that confusion of formative, summative, etc., etc., in fact, the current terminology which is used is what is called assessment of learning and assessment for learning. और अगर इसमें आपने एक थर्ड भी ऐड करनी हो तो दैट इज असेसमेंट एज लर्निंग। सो अभी हम उस स्टेज पे नहीं पहुंचे हैं, बट एटलीस्ट वी कैन टॉक अबाउट असेसमेंट ऑफ लर्निंग एंड फॉर लर्निंग। ऑफ लर्निंग, summative, happening at the end of it, so accumulation of knowledge and information, assessment of the content which is learned, and to qualify the student for the next level. That is what you are doing in assessment of learning. When you are talking of assessment for learning, the purpose is totally different. You don't want to tell them तुम pass हो, तुम fail हो, तुम distinction वाले हो, तुम non distinction वाले हो. That is not the purpose. The purpose is you are helping them to construct meaning and make sense of the information that has been provided in the classroom. You are also telling them how learning takes place. Is he simply memorizing, or he is trying to understand, or he learns something and goes to the ward and tries to apply it on the patient and then learns better. So this is all what you have to do. And in fact, Rajiv and I had proposed this model of competency-based assessment 5 7 years ago. And if you look at this model, and this is what actually is universally accepted, what you would notice here, that summative assessment is much smaller as compared to formative assessment. It may not be in that proportion, but if you look at the literature, most people will say 75-25. So 3/4 of all your assessment should be formative. Only 25 or even less should actually be summative. Or formative में, what are the important things? 3 things. One, feed up, feedback, feed forward. And I remember as a small child when I was in fifth or sixth class, and when I used to go for my examinations, so my mother would brief me before I went to school. So she would tell me, देख वो ये वाला सवाल पूछेंगे, उसमें ना ये वाली चीजें लिखनी होती हैं, तो ध्यान रखना, ये पूछें तो ये लिखना, ये पूछें तो ये लिखना, उसको ऐसे एक्सप्लेन करना, ऐसे एलोबरेट करना, एटसेट्रा एटसेट्रा. Then I'll go and answer the question paper, come back, then she'll again ask me, अच्छा तू क्या लिख के आया? So I'll tell her I wrote this, and then she'll tell me कि हाँ ये तो ठीक है पर इसको थोड़ा और तरीके से कर सकते थे, इसको ऐसे करना चाहिए था. चल कोई नहीं, अब ये तो हो गया ना, अगली बार जब इम्तिहान होए तब ख्याल रखना कि तू इसको ऐसे लिखे और इसको ऐसे लिखे. बस वही कंसेप्ट यहाँ पे लग रहे हैं. फीड अप व्हेन यू टेल द स्टूडेंट इन एडवांस कि उसने क्या करना. फीडबैक जब वो कर चुका है, एंड देन यू आर टेलिंग हिम कि जो किया उसने वो ठीक किया नहीं किया. एंड फीड फॉरवर्ड is next time when you face a similar situation, then what you are doing. And ये सारी, I gave you this example which must be at least 50 years old.
It's a very nice example, and I did done the same with my kids.
I suppose every parent does that. You know, उस टाइम जब हमको ये मिलते थे तो हमें ये थोड़ी पता था कि अब फीड अप हो रहा है कि अब फीडबैक हो रहा है, नहीं पता था. एंड दिस एग्जांपल मस्ट बी 50-60 years old. 50 तो कहीं नहीं गया, 60 ना भी थी तो 50 तो कहीं नहीं गया. So most of the concepts in education are actually well known. ओनली थिंग इज कि वो विद पीरियड ऑफ टाइम वो थोड़े 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 डिजॉल्व होते जाते हैं, और हम ये तो पुरानी बात है, ये तो पुरानी बात है करके हम उनको छोड़ते जाते हैं. बट इन फैक्ट एक्चुअली इफ यू लुक एट इट, एंड yesterday only I got one PDF. I'll send to you. You can share in the group. They have traced the history of education, like what used to happen in Gurukul era and how it has evolved, and what can we learn from that period, and how can we apply some of those concepts in the present. Now, you also would notice that self-assessment, and this is one of the key factors. If you want to take a scientific terminology, then this is called metacognition, means how you learn. So self-assessment and reflections are two things which are very important for formative assessment. Simply by telling अगली बार ऐसे कर देना will not work. The student has to reflect, and that is, like some of you must have heard that in mentoring workshops, that you don't learn from experience, you learn from reflecting on that experience. And if you are not reflecting on your experience, then unfortunately no learning would be taking place. Now there's a very common example you all must have heard. When the cook tastes the soup, it is called a formative. And when the guest tastes the soup, it is called summative. And it needs more clarity, basically. I'll give you a small example again. Shreya invites me for dinner. She prepares tomato soup. Before I reach her house, she tastes a bit of it. Namak kam hai. Okay. I arrive. I am served that soup. I drink it. I also say namak kam hai. ये फॉर्मेटिव हुआ कि नहीं हुआ? नहीं हुआ. So cook tasting the soup alone is not formative. What becomes formative? Cook tasting the soup and taking corrective action. That is what is important. And why I am repeatedly emphasizing that is that in your so-called formative assessments, quote and unquote, unless you are really using it to take corrective actions, they are not formative. You are only indulging in a summative assessment. And remember, all assessments are summative because they are all end of something. You can use multiple examples. I have used a garden analogy, but as a pediatrician, I think a well baby clinic provides a very good example of this. In one of the African countries, a European country gave lot of equipment for vaccine storage, and they were very happy that we have provided equipment for maintaining cold chain, and now the vaccines will be properly stored, and so on and so on. So after a few years, they decided, okay, let's go and see what they are doing. So they reached the primary health center in the African country, and they asked the person, what are you doing with these? She says, "Sir, these are very good equipment. You gave us that dial thermometer. We keep it in the refrigerator and we record the temperature every day and see that is it between 2 to 8 or beyond that." So those Europeans were impressed. So before leaving, one of them asked, okay, tell me, what do you do if it goes beyond 8 degrees centigrade? He says, sir, we write in the register. तो वो हमारा फॉर्मेटिव ना वो ऐसे ही हो जाता है, we write in the register. That doesn't help us. See everything. आपके बगीचे में पौधा लगा है, तो आप रोज उसको नापते रहो, नाप के एक्शन लेना पड़ेगा, तभी इट विल बी ऑफ एनी यूज. अदरवाइज इट्स जस्ट वेस्ट ऑफ टाइम, एनर्जी, एफर्ट. यू कैन गिव मल्टीपल एग्जांपल्स. वेल बेबी क्लिनिक में बच्चा आता है, स्टंटिंग है, मेल न्यूट्रिशन है, यू हैव टू टेक एक्शन. जस्ट प्लॉटिंग द वेट ऑन ए चार्ट एंड ओके जाओ अगले महीने फिर आगे दिखा जाना. दैट डजंट हेल्प अस. नो, विद समेटिव देयर आर लॉट ऑफ इश्यूज. सबसे बड़ा इशू तो यही होता है कि वो स्टेक उसकी बहुत हाई होती है. वो स्टूडेंट को पता होता है कि अगर मैं इसमें फेल हो गया तो मेरे 6 महीने या 1 साल या कभी कभी 1.5 साल मेरा वेस्ट हो जाए. So he tries to hide his ignorance and make you believe that he knows even when he doesn't know. That is one of the biggest problem of summative. Formative में वो नहीं होता, चलो एक टेस्ट अच्छा नहीं किया अगला ठीक कर ले, अगला नहीं अच्छा किया अगला ठीक कर लेगा, कोई बात. बट मोर देन दैट, जो डे टू डे वेरिएबिलिटी होती है, तो हमारे साथ भी तो ऐसे होता है. जब आपका एमसीआई या एनएमसी इंस्पेक्शन होना होता है तो आप भी तो कहते हो आज पेशेंट कम है, कल के देख लो. फाइन, इट कैन हैपन. Same thing can happen with students. One particular day he may be having a headache, he may have some other problem, he may have a fight at home or something, which can affect his performance. So deciding everything just on one test is totally wrong. And then examination anxiety. And more importantly, जो टीचिंग और असेसिंग होता है वो कभी भी एक जैसा नहीं हो पाता. आई विल गिव यू लिटिल मोर एग्जांपल ऑन दैट. And therefore, the validity of summative assessment for future decision is always questionable. जो summative decision है, it doesn't resemble what the students have to go out and do in actual practice. नीट देख लो, नेक्स्ट देख लो, उसके बेस पे आप इतना बड़ा मेजर डिसीजन लेते हो. बट टेल मी, विल एवर एनी पेशेंट कम टू द डॉक्टर एंड से डॉक्टर साहब पेट दर्द हो रहा है, ए appendicitis, B cholecystitis, C pancreatitis, D gastritis, बताओ क्या है? Nobody will come and do that. So वो जो mismatch होता है between what you are teaching and assessing and what the student has actually to do, there's a lot of mismatch, and that creates a lot of issues. Second problem, summative is actually reductionist. आप एक MCQ टेस्ट देते हो अपनी क्लास में. Now, what information is available to you? It can tell you which areas the student could not answer. It can tell you what were the common mistakes of not only the student but also of the class, so that you can teach them better next time. It tells you the system wise breakup of knowledge. CVS तो अच्छा पढ़ लिया था, CNS में थोड़ी प्रॉब्लम आ रही है, so maybe we need to focus more on that. And of course it tells you what is the level of the attainment of the student. पर जब आप उसको नंबर दे के और लिस्ट बना देते हो, तब आप वो सारी इंफॉर्मेशन भूल जाते हो. तब आपको क्या पता होता है कि वो कितने उसने आंसर नहीं किए, कितने उसने गलत आंसर किए, उसका स्कोर कितना था और बाकियों का स्कोर कितना था. यही रह जाता है जो आप लिस्ट लगाते हो अपने असेसमेंट के बाद में. दिस इज व्हाट इज लेफ्ट. वो जो बाकी रिच इंफॉर्मेशन होती है वो सारी मिस हो जाती है, हम उसको ध्यान ही नहीं देते. तो ये जो रिडक्शनिस्ट अप्रोच है समेटिव असेसमेंट की, दैट एक्चुअली क्रिएट्स ए इशू. नो, दिस इज वन ऑफ माय फेवरेट्स, द यूटिलिटी ऑफ असेसमेंट. एंड please remember that when I say utility of assessment and represented by validity multiplied by reliability multiplied by feasibility multiplied by acceptability multiplied by educational impact, you don't have to actually multiply anything by anything. It's only a notional concept. और ये मल्टीप्लिकेशन वाला फैक्टर इसमें क्यों लाया गया? जस्ट टू इलस्ट्रेट कि अगर इसमें से कोई एक भी जीरो हो गया तो सारा कुछ जीरो हो जाएगा. दैट इज द इंपॉर्टेंट पॉइंट यू नीड टू कीप इन माइंड. और कोई भी असेसमेंट परफेक्ट नहीं होता. You cannot have an assessment which is highly valid also, highly reliable also, which is highly acceptable also. No, no assessment will be like that. कोई वैलिड होगा तो रिलायबिलिटी का इशू आ जाएगा. लाइक फॉर एग्जांपल केस प्रेजेंटेशन वर्सेस ऑस्की. ऑस्की may not be highly valid assessment of clinical competence, but it would be more reliable. Case presentation, for example, is highly valid, but might be less reliable. तो आपको हमेशा एक ट्रेड ऑफ करना पड़ता है बिटवीन वैलिडिटी एंड रिलायबिलिटी, डिपेंडिंग ऑन योर पर्पस. अगर आपका पर्पस सिलेक्शन है, आपने पीजी एंट्रेंस करना है, देन यू वुड गो मोर ऑन रिलायबिलिटी, क्योंकि वैलिडिटी तो आप उनकी पहले असेस यूनिवर्सिटी एग्जाम में कर चुके हो. अब आप रिलायबिलिटी पे जाओगे. पर अगर आपने फॉर्मेटिव करना है, देन यूर फोकस विल बी ऑन इम्पैक्ट. इस असेसमेंट से स्टूडेंट कितना सीखता है, दैट इज व्हाट यूर इम्पैक्ट विल बी. So keep in mind that there is always a meaningful trade-off. अभी क्या होता है वो अपने आप होता है, हमारा कोई कंट्रोल नहीं होता उसके ऊपर. बट व्हेन यू एक्चुअली डू फॉर्मेटिव, प्लीज डू अ ट्रेड ऑफ कि हियर आई एम ओके विद लिटिल लेस ऑब्जेक्टिव but more educationally impactful, and here I want more objectivity and reliability, maybe little less of value. Now, when you come to validity and reliability of formative assessment, in fact, last month we published this paper, Validity in Student Assessment, or this month is coming validity reliability in formative assessment. वो भी आया नहीं है तो इसलिए I couldn't put the screenshot over here. I'll share as soon as it comes out. The point is that the validity and reliability of formative and summative cannot be considered the same way. You remember MCQs when we were having that teacher faculty development workshops, and I had shown you a graph. You need at least 200 questions with a discrimination index of 0.35 to give you a reliability of 0.8. हम कितने करते हैं क्लास में एक्चुअली? 5, 10, 15. इवन यूनिवर्सिटी एग्जाम में कितने हैं? 20. So 20 questions will never give you reliability. वो सिर्फ जी बहलाने वाली बात होती है कि एमसीक्यू किए थे हमने, बट विदाउट एनी मीनिंग. एंड consequences of assessment therefore become important here. What is a good validity? It is the consequence of assessment. अगर आप एक डॉक्टर को डिग्री दे के भेज रहे हो जिसमें आपने लिखा है ही इज सर्टिफाइड टू प्रैक्टिस मेडिसिन एंड सर्जरी, कैन ही प्रैक्टिस मेडिसिन एंड सर्जरी? दैट इज द वैलिडिटी एविडेंस. कैन ही कंडक्ट ए नॉर्मल डिलीवरी? दैट इज द वैलिडिटी एविडेंस. अगर वो नहीं कर सकता तो फिर आपके ये सारे असेसमेंट का कोई मतलब नहीं निकलता. So the validity of formative assessment will be that if your assessment is helping the student to reach a goal, it is valid. Summative, it will be valid when it gives you a accurate idea of the student's attainment. Let's look at influences of learning. When you give marks or grades, actually grades में problem कम है, marks में ज़्यादा है. In marks, you divide the performance into 100 points. And then you presume that everybody knows what that point is. तो मतलब अगर मैंने 51 दिए और तनवीर ने 51 दिए तो हम दोनों को पता है कि 51 का मतलब क्या था. और प्रमोद ने 52 दे दिए तो इसका मतलब वो वाला कैंडिडेट उससे ज्यादा कॉम्पिटेंट है, और किसी और ने 49 दे दिए तो वो कॉम्पिटेंट नहीं है. And this is when we know that the average difference between examiners giving marks on a theory question are 6 to 15%. So on the same question, a student can fail, and on the same question, he can get a first class. We don't have that class system in medical education, but 60 से ऊपर आ सकते हैं, 65 आ सकते हैं उसके, और इधर 35 जा सकते हैं. अगर आप उनको फीडबैक देते हो तो it improves learning. And in fact, interestingly, students who were taking more than one test, formative, they scored higher compared to those taking no test. So if you have 10 students in your class, 5 come for formative, 5 don't come. So those 5 who had come for assessment would definitely have higher marks as compared to. Now I come to instructional sensitivity, which I had said little while ago. तो अगर ये आपकी रोड्स हैं, ये इधर बढ़िया फाइनली ग्रेनुलर रोड और इधर वो मट्टे पत्थर वाली खड्डों वाली रोड. So the entrance examinations are like this. And as you keep on moving, the quality of road keeps on improving. Formative assessment में आप जो पढ़ाते हो आप वही पूछते हो. अगर आपने लेक्चर लिया फॉर एग्जांपल एनाटॉमी ऑफ हार्ट, तो फॉर्मेटिव में आप वही पूछोगे ना, ब्रेन की थोड़ी पूछोगे. बट समेटिव में क्या होता है? जस्ट लुक एट नीट. जो पूछते हैं वो पढ़ाते नहीं, और जो पढ़ाते हैं वो पूछते नहीं. सो देयर इज ऑलवेज ए मिसमैच. between what the student is taught and between what the student is actually assessed. Exactly, क्योंकि हम तो उनको वो पढ़ाते ही नहीं है जिसपे उनका सिलेक्शन होना है, so they have to go somewhere else and read it. तो हमारे पास तो बेसिकली वो अटेंडेंस के लिए आते हैं कि वो बायोमेट्रिक लगेगी तो वो वहाँ एनएमसी में जाएगी, तो बस उतना ठीक होना चाहिए, लर्निंग के लिए नहीं आते हमारे. These are three educational psychological issues. Just take little time to understand them. Even if you don't get it here, maybe you can just Google it later and read more about that. Messick, and this is a gentleman who gave a lot of theories on validity. Now, what he says is that there is always a gap between what the student knows and what he needs to know. जो आपके ऑब्जेक्टिव आपने लिख रखे हैं, जो कॉम्पिटेंसीज आपने बना रखी हैं, दैट इज द नीड टू नो, एंड देन देयर इज व्हाट ही एक्चुअली नोज. सेम वे वाइगॉट्स्की, अगेन एन एजुकेशनल साइकोलॉजिस्ट, और ये इतना पुराना बोला था, ये 34 में. व्हाट ही सेड इज कि ये कट ऑफ है जहां पर स्टूडेंट को सब आता है, और ये कट ऑफ है जहां उसको कुछ नहीं आता. अब एज ए टीचर अगर आप उसको इस जोन में पढ़ाओगे जहां उसको आता है, तो इट्स ए वेस्ट. अगर आप उसको उस जोन में पढ़ाओगे जहां उसको कुछ नहीं आता, अगेन इट्स ए वेस्ट. तो आपने कहां पढ़ाना है उसको, जहां पे वो दोनों तो फॉर्मेटिव असेसमेंट का पर्पस क्या है? आप उसका असेस करके उस लेवल तक जाना चाहते हो जहां पे आपको पता लग जाए कि दिस इज द एंड ऑफ हिज लर्निंग एंड नाउ ही नीड्स टू लर्न. समेटिव में क्या होता है, आप उसके आगे चले जाते हो, वहां पे पढ़ाने का कोई एडवांटेज नहीं हो. And somehow many of us are actually comfortable teaching what we also know, students also know, rather than teaching something, new or different. CMC में Dr. Bhatti होते थे हमारे principal. Many of you might have heard about him. He was an ophthalmologist. His son and daughter were both MBBS students. So घर पे वो पढ़ाता तो उनको आई, पढ़ते नहीं थे. वन डे आज देम, भाई क्यों नहीं पढ़ते हो, तो मैं को इतना पढ़ाता हूँ, तो वो कितने खुश नसीब हो कि तुम्हारे घर में कोई तुमको पढ़ा रहा है. कहते हैं जो हमको आता है वही पढ़ाई जाती है, उसका क्या फायदा. एंड दैट्स व्हाट वेरी कॉमनली हैपेंस. और या हम वो पढ़ाते हैं जो उनको बिल्कुल ही नहीं आता. सो दैट इज वेयर फॉर्मेटिव असेसमेंट विल हेल्प यू. So this is what formative assessment actually does, that it generates students' achievement information for two things. One, to monitor the individual student's progress in terms of what the student did or did not learn, and what the students can or cannot do. And secondly, it helps you to evaluate the instructional effectiveness by modifying instruction and by reteaching. अकेली फीडबैक जो आप स्टूडेंट्स को लेते हो ना, वो इसीलिए काम नहीं करती है क्योंकि उनको पता होता है हम तो जा रहे हैं, हमें क्या. सर ने पूछा था मेरी क्लास अच्छी थी, ठीक है हम लिख देते हैं अच्छी थी. So formative assessment and feedback has to be used for the same batch to be effective. अगर आप ऐसे कर रहे हो कि अच्छा तुम फीडबैक दे जाओ, वो अगले वालों को मैं ज्यादा अच्छे तरीके से पढ़ाऊंगा, that doesn't work. So any questions related to whatever we have discussed?
हमने काफी कुछ खराब भी हुआ, सुना भी हुआ है, but still the example was true. Yeah, already to the main time of this thing is community to the side to as anything big, you know, supporting direction के बिना नहीं तो वो कहीं भी जा सकती है। क्योंकि वही ना मतलब टाइम भी चाहिए, मतलब मेनली तो यही इशू हो जाता है कि हमें वो स्टूडेंट का नंबर ज्यादा होता है, तो हमें पता भी है उनकी प्रॉब्लम्स हैं।
पर वो तब होता है जब हम सिर्फ फॉर्मल असेसमेंट करना मांग रहे हैं। इनफॉर्मल जब करना होता है, लाइक फॉर एग्जांपल, आई डोंट नो इफ यू हैव दैट काइंड ऑफ ए सिस्टम ओवर हियर। तो सीएमसी में क्या होता था, वो आधे घंटे का ना टी ब्रेक होता था, 10 to 10:30। तो हम सारे पीजीज फॉर एग्जांपल राउंड रूम लेके वहाँ चाय पीने बैठे होते थे। तो वही होता, अच्छा ये वो कल जो पेशेंट देखा था उसका रिपोर्ट जरा बताना फिर से। वही हो जाता था फॉर्मल असेसमेंट, इनफॉर्मल असेसमेंट। You don't have to make them sit in a classroom and write 5 pages to diagnose their learning. आप कॉरिडोर में जा रहे हो, वहीं पे अच्छा बाय द वे, तुमने वो जो कल पेशेंट देखा था ना, उसके वो लिवर बायोप्सी में वो निकला है, सो यू वर सेइंग लाइक दिस बट एक्चुअली सी व्हाट काइंड ऑफ डिफरेंस दैट कैन बी। ओके।
जी मैं इनफैक्ट होती है इनफॉर्मल असेसमेंट है इन सब
इवन यूजी में भी नहीं, स्पेशली जब आपके स्मॉल ग्रुप डिस्कशंस होते हैं, जब आपके सेमिनार्स और सिम्पोजिया होते हैं, तो दैट इज द टाइम व्हेन यू कैन एक्चुअली यूज दिस काइंड ऑफ इंफॉर्मेशन।
So when we leave is after training for 4 years, whatever say he or she learns after that, what kind of education you think it is, and what kind of assessment is required?
आफ्टर कंप्लीटिंग,
Becomes a good plan.
सर उसके लिए तो फिर वो ना, इफ यू रिमेम्बर वन ऑफ द फिगर्स आई टॉक्ड अबाउट वर्क प्लेस बेस्ड असेसमेंट। तो वो इम्पैक्ट देखना पड़ेगा, खाली यही देखने का कि उसको कितना आता है प्रॉब्ली मे नॉट बी इनफ। लाइक ये कॉम्पिटेंसी बेस्ड करिकुलम आया है, अब इसमें सिर्फ यही दिखा के उन्होंने कॉम्पिटेंसी एक्वायर कर ली, हम खुश नहीं हो सकते। क्योंकि जो पर्पस था कॉम्पिटेंसी बेस्ड का वो ये था कि ये कॉम्पिटेंसीज एक्वायर करके कम्युनिटी में जाके वहां पे अप्लाई करके हेल्थ स्टेटस सुधारेंगे पॉपुलेशन का। तो फिर हमको वो असेस करना पड़ेगा, इज इट वर्किंग दैट वे। अगर वो नहीं कर रहा, अब वो सिर्फ वो कॉम्पिटेंसी एक्वायर कर ही जा रहे हैं, दैट प्रॉब्ली इज नथिंग टू बी हैप्पी अबाउट। तो वो ना इम्पैक्ट उसका जो है, और इस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में स्पेशली फेमर पीपल वुड हैव हर्ड दिस टर्म, वी यूज इट आउटपुट एंड आउटकम। आउटपुट तो ठीक है, 4 क्लास ली, 6 टेस्ट दिए, 10 पेशेंट दिखा दिए, ये कर दिया वो कर दिया, वो आउटपुट हो गया। वो आउटकम क्या हुआ? एज ए रिजल्ट ऑफ दिस, डिड ही लर्न हाउ टू कंडक्ट ए नॉर्मल डिलीवरी? आउटकम नहीं आया तो फिर आउटपुट का क्या फायदा? आपने उसको 20 डिलीवरी दिखाई या 50 डिलीवरी दिखाई, फायदा क्या होगा? और अगर आउटकम भी आ गया तो फिर उसका इम्पैक्ट, दैट इज द नेक्स्ट स्टेज, कि डिड इट रिड्यूस इन्फेंट मोर्टेलिटी, डिड इट रिड्यूस मैटरनल मोर्टेलिटी? अगर वो नहीं हुआ तो अगेन दिस इज ऑल यूजलेस। सो एक्चुअली स्पीकिंग, कॉम्पिटेंसी बेस्ड ना वो एमबीबीएस पे खत्म नहीं हो जाती, इट्स ओनली वन बिगिनिंग which should continue into PG, which should continue into practice, और incremental, it should be like a bank account, कि जो आपने अपनी कॉम्पिटेंसीज उसमें जमा हो गई, वो जमा रहती हैं, हम भूलते तो नहीं है ना। साइकिल चलाना आप ना भी चलाओ, 20 साल ना चलाओ, भूलते थोड़ी हो। तो सेम वे बड़ी सारी चीजें हम, बड़ी स्किल्स ऐसे मेडिसिन में भी सीखते हैं जो हम भूलते नहीं है। लाइक वो, when I was a resident in PG, and I'm talking of 82, 83, we didn't have those small needles। तो कोई पेशेंट आ जाता था तो विनिसेक्शन करके उसमें कैनुला डालते थे। 40 साल हो गए तो छोड़े हुए, पर अभी भी मैं आज के रेजिडेंट से ज्यादा फास्ट डाल सकता हूँ, बिकॉज यू डोंट फॉरगेट दोस काइंड ऑफ थिंग। So we'll meet again next week. And can we do that side only? Seminar room. Is that okay, sir? नहीं नहीं, कुछ और ना हो, बस वो देख लेना.
तो वहां पे कुछ और क्लासेस वगैरह होती हैं वैसे भी.
अच्छा, चलो यहाँ भी ठीक है, नो नो प्रॉब्लम. कोई बात नहीं सर.
वैसे भी यहाँ पे.
चलिए, ओके जी. थैंक यू सर.
Thank you, sir.